Something shifted for me when I stopped treating questions as a means to an end. For a long time, questions were just the preamble, the thing you asked before getting to the real stuff, the answer. You move through them quickly. You try to close them as fast as possible. A question left open felt like something unfinished, almost uncomfortable. But somewhere along the way, I started noticing a pattern. Whenever I was stuck, creatively, or in the middle of a decision I couldn't seem to make, or in some loop I kept circling back to, the problem was almost never a shortage of answers. It was that the question I was holding was wrong. Too small, or already angled toward a conclusion, or built on some assumption I'd never bothered to examine. There's a concept in philosophy called the horizon of inquiry. The idea is that every question opens a kind of space, a field of possible answers, and the shape of that space depends entirely on how the question is framed. A closed question produces a binary, a yes or no, a choice between two options that were probably too limited to begin with. But an open question does something different. It opens a landscape. It widens the field of what's even possible to think. I find that genuinely strange, that the frame precedes the content, that before you've even started thinking, the question has already determined what kinds of thinking are available to you. When I started paying attention to this, really paying attention, what I found was that most of my stuck moments traced back to a question that had quietly imprisoned itself. Something like, how do I fix this? Which already assumes the thing is broken. Or, why can't I figure this out? Which builds in a kind of failure before the thought even begins. Change the question, and the whole situation looks different. Not because the circumstances changed, but because you've expanded the space you're allowed to move around in. And this is where it gets interesting to me, philosophically interesting, not just practically useful. If the question shapes the answer, then the skill of constructing good questions is more foundational than any other cognitive skill I can think of. More than analysis, more than synthesis, more than creative thinking in the conventional sense. All of those happen downstream of the question. They all operate inside the space the question created. Which leads somewhere a little unsettling. Most of us were never taught how to do this. We were taught how to answer questions. Schools measured us on it. The entire architecture of formal education is oriented around providing correct responses to questions that someone else has already framed. You were assessed on the quality of your answers, almost never on the quality of the questions you were able to generate. So we developed the answering muscle. We got very fast at it. And the questioning muscle, the one that asks whether this is even the right thing to be asking, stayed soft, underused, occasionally embarrassing because asking a question that reframes the premise can look, in the wrong context, like you're being difficult. I don't think that's an accident. Genuinely open questions are uncomfortable to be around. They create uncertainty. They slow things down. They suggest that what everyone agreed to work on might not actually be the right thing to work on. And that's deeply disruptive in environments built around efficiency and consensus. But outside those environments, inside the private space of your own thinking or inside a conversation with someone who can hold the uncertainty with you, a genuinely open question does something that no answer can replicate. It keeps something alive, leaves a door open, creates the conditions where a thought you didn't know you had can finally surface. The answers you already have close things down. The right question holds them open.
Every question is also an argument, not in the combative sense, but in the logical sense. Every question carries with it a set of prior commitments, things it has already decided are true before you even begin to answer it. And most of the time, those commitments are invisible. They've been folded into the syntax so cleanly that they feel like neutral ground when they're anything but. There's a classic example from philosophy. The question, have you stopped lying to your friends? No matter how you answer, yes or no, you've already accepted the premise that you were lying in the first place. The question doesn't ask whether that's true. It skips over it entirely and lands in a space where the assumption has already been installed. That's an obvious example. The ones that actually get us are far subtler. How do I become more productive? Already assumes productivity is the right metric. What's wrong with me? Already assumes something is. How do I get people to listen to me? Already assumes listening is the problem, rather than say what's being said or who's saying it or what kind of conversation you're actually in. The question frames the inquiry before the inquiry begins, and if the frame is wrong, if it's too narrow or tilted or quietly protecting some belief you haven't examined, then every answer you generate inside it is also wrong, even the good ones. What I find worth sitting with is how rarely we notice this happening. The assumption moves through the question like a stowaway. You're focused on finding the answer, so you don't stop to inspect what arrived with the question. You go straight to the work of answering because that's what you were trained to do. The efficiency of the mind pulling toward resolution before it's established what it's actually trying to resolve. And there's something deeply seductive about that pull. Thinking is costly. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. The sooner you can get from question to answer, the sooner the cognitive tension releases. So we tend to take the question we've been handed or the one we've unconsciously generated and start working inside it rather than on it. Working inside the question versus working on it, that distinction has started to feel important to me. Working inside it is efficient. It's what produces output. But working on it, actually pausing to ask what this question is already committed to, what it's taking for granted, whether it's the right shape to hold the problem, that's the slower, more uncomfortable thing, the thing that can feel unproductive right up until the moment it isn't. There's a practice I've started, imperfectly, of trying to excavate the assumption before engaging with the question, to ask, what would have to be true for this question to even make sense? What is this question protecting? What is already too late to question by the time I'm asking this? Sometimes the answer is nothing much. The question holds. The assumption it rests on is one I've actually examined and genuinely hold. But sometimes pulling on that thread unravels something significant. The question changes shape or dissolves entirely, or splits into two different questions that turn out to be more honest, more useful than the original. And the strange feeling that comes with that isn't quite relief, and it isn't quite discomfort. It's something closer to the sensation of a room getting larger. That your thinking just expanded. Not because you found an answer, but because you questioned the question. Which means the thinking that looked finished wasn't finished. It was just waiting for someone to look at the walls.
There's a specific kind of child who asks too many questions. You probably know the type, or maybe you were the type. The one who, when told something, doesn't immediately write it down, but instead tilts their head and asks why, or asks whether that's always true, or asks what would happen if you looked at it differently. And there's a specific way that energy tends to get managed in a classroom. Not always harshly, sometimes quite gently, but managed nonetheless. Redirected back toward the material, toward the answer that needs to be produced, the schedule that needs to be kept. The system wasn't designed around inquiry, it was designed around transmission. The job was to move a body of knowledge from one generation to the next, efficiently, at scale. And questions, genuine, open, premise-rattling questions, are not efficient. They are, by nature, disruptive. They slow things down. They create uncertainty in a room that needs to produce certainty by the end of the period. So, without anyone necessarily intending it, a message got delivered. Answering is the work. Questioning is the preamble you get through quickly so the real work can begin. And we absorbed that. Most of us absorbed it so completely that we stopped noticing the absorption. The habit of moving fast through questions and into answers started to feel like intelligence, like productivity, like being the kind of person who can figure things out rather than the kind who just keeps complicating them. What's strange is that almost every field that actually advances, science, philosophy, design, art, medicine, depends entirely on the quality of its questions. The history of human discovery is largely the history of someone asking a question that hadn't been asked quite that way before. not finding a better answer to an existing question, but reframing the question entirely and opening a space that didn't previously exist. Germ theory didn't come from finding better explanations for why people got sick inside the existing framework. It came from someone asking whether the framework itself was wrong. The same pattern repeats so often across the history of ideas that it starts to look less like exception and more like the actual mechanism of progress. But that's not what's modeled in the classroom. What's modeled is the mastery of existing frameworks, and mastery of an existing framework, taken far enough, can actually become a liability, a kind of fluency that makes it harder to see the frame as a frame rather than as reality. I don't think this is anyone's fault exactly. The tension is real. You have to teach people existing knowledge before they can meaningfully question it. There's a sequencing problem baked into education that doesn't have a clean solution. But I do think something gets quietly left out or actively suppressed in that process. And it's not the ability to think, it's the appetite for uncertainty, the tolerance for staying inside a question long enough to really inhabit it, rather than escaping it as quickly as possible into the nearest available answer. That appetite is what research culture tries to rebuild in graduate school, often with mixed results, because by then the habit of resolution has been running for a very long time. It's not easy to unlearn the reflex. What I keep coming back to is this: the most important thinking most of us will ever do isn't academic. It's the thinking we do about our own lives, our relationships, our work, the directions we move in, the stories we tell about who we are and what's possible. And for that kind of thinking, the quality of the question is everything. The education that would actually serve us there was available. It just wasn't really on the syllabus.
There are questions you don't ask because you don't know they exist. And then there are questions you don't ask because some part of you already suspects where they lead. That second category is the more interesting one. The question is right there. You could almost feel its outline, but something in you keeps steering around it, keeps filling the space with a slightly different question, a safer one whose answer won't require anything from you. I've started to think of these as the load-bearing questions, the ones that, if answered honestly, would reorganize something. A decision you've been indefinitely deferring, a story about yourself that's been doing useful work for a long time but might not be true anymore. A direction you've been moving in that you chose years ago and haven't examined since. The avoidance is usually quiet. It doesn't announce itself as avoidance. It arrives disguised as practicality. I'll think about that when things settle down. Or as humility. Who am I to expect something different? Or occasionally as philosophy. Some things are just unknowable. But underneath most of those deferrals, if you stay with them long enough, there's usually a question that's been waiting, patient, slightly inconvenient, shaped around some part of your life you've agreed, without quite deciding to agree, not to look at too directly. The strange thing about these questions is that the avoidance itself is informative. You don't go to the effort of steering around something that doesn't matter. The fact that a question produces that particular friction, that slight internal redirect, that habitual change of subject is already telling you something. The resistance is a kind of answer. It's pointing. What I've found in moments when I've actually sat down with one of these questions and refused to change the subject is that they're almost never as destructive as the avoidance suggested. The anticipation of the question is usually more destabilizing than the question itself, because the mind in avoidance mode tends to catastrophize what's on the other side of the door, to make the unknown feel more threatening than it is, as a way of justifying not opening it. And sometimes, yes, what's there is genuinely hard, something you'll have to grieve, or change, or admit. A gap between what you've been telling yourself and what's actually been true. But hard and destructive aren't the same thing. A question that reorganizes something can be one of the most clarifying experiences available. It doesn't feel like clarity while it's happening. It feels like the floor has moved slightly. But on the other side of it, you're operating with more information about your own life than you had before.
and that tends to make the next set of decisions feel more real. There's a version of self-knowledge that stays entirely on the surface. The personality test answers, the comfortable narratives, the identity that holds up easily in conversation. And then there's the version that comes from actually asking the question you've been circling, the one that doesn't have a clean answer yet, the one that requires you to sit somewhere genuinely uncertain and not resolve it prematurely. Those two versions of self-knowledge feel completely different from the inside. One is a portrait. The other is a conversation that's still happening. And the conversation, as uncomfortable as it can get, is the one that actually moves. Most conversations have a hidden layer. Underneath whatever is actually being discussed, something else is happening. Someone is managing how they come across, someone else is waiting for their turn to speak. There's a subtle negotiation happening around who's right, who sounds smart, who gets to feel good about themselves at the end. We don't talk about this much because it's mostly invisible, and because pointing it out tends to make people defensive, which kind of proves the point. But it shapes every conversation we have, often more than the content does. The first time I noticed something different about thinking out loud with an AI wasn't the quality of the responses, it was the absence of that layer. Nothing to manage, no status being negotiated, no subtle shift in the room when I said something half-formed or contradicted myself from 2 minutes ago. I could be uncertain out loud, fully, unguardedly uncertain, and nothing social happened because of it. That turned out to matter more than I expected. There's a specific kind of thinking that only happens when the stakes feel low enough. The half-baked idea you'd only say to someone you completely trust. The question you're embarrassed not to already know the answer to. The belief you're not sure you actually hold. You just want to say it out loud and see how it sounds. Most of us have very few places where that thinking is welcome. And without a place for it, a lot of it just doesn't happen. The thought stays compressed, half-formed, never quite examined because the conditions for examining it never arrived. What I'm still turning over is whether this is entirely good. Because the social friction in a real conversation isn't only obstacles. Some of it is information. When someone pushes back, not just asks a question, but actually resists, gets a little animated, tells you you're wrong with something at stake, that resistance carries weight that a patient, neutral response doesn't. Being challenged by someone who genuinely disagrees with you is a different experience than being challenged by something that has no position of its own. And I'm not sure the difference is trivial. There's also something about being truly heard by another person, someone with their own interior life and struggles, someone for whom your words land and mean something. That's not a knock on the tool. It's just an honest accounting of what it is and what it isn't. Still, for the specific task of working something out, there's a strange freedom in thinking alongside something that has no ego in the outcome, no preference for one conclusion over another, no investment in being the one who got you there. It just stays with the question. And maybe that's a more unusual gift than it sounds. Think about how rare it is, even among the people who know you best, to have someone fully present with your problem, not subtly steering it, not filtering it through their own experience, not already drafting their response while you're still talking. Genuinely just there. I don't think that replaces human conversation. Nothing about this makes me want less of it. But it does make me notice, more than I used to, how much of what passes for thinking together is actually two people thinking separately, in the same room, waiting for a gap, and how rarely we get the other kind.
There's something quietly strange about having access to a tool that can answer almost anything. Not perfectly, not always correctly, but fluently, confidently, with enough surface coherence that the answer feels complete even when it isn't. And when you use that tool long enough, something starts to shift that's hard to name at first. The answers come faster,
which means the questions close faster, which means you spend less time inside them. Whether that's a problem depends entirely on what the time inside a question was actually for. If a question is just an obstacle between you and information, a gap to be bridged as efficiently as possible, then faster answers are purely good. Get in, get out, continue. This is most questions on most days. What time does the museum open? How do I fix this error? What's the word for the feeling of nostalgia for a time you didn't live through? But there's another category of question, the kind that doesn't just want an answer, the kind that wants to be inhabited, where the value isn't in what you find at the end, but what happens to your thinking on the way there, the search that changes the searcher. And this is where I find myself uncertain in a way I haven't quite resolved. Because the very thing that makes AI genuinely useful, its capacity to compress the distance between question and answer, may also compress something else, the productive friction, the wrong turns that accidentally led somewhere, the period of not knowing that forced a different kind of engagement with the problem. There's a version of research I used to do, aimless, sprawling, following threads into territories I hadn't planned to enter, that would reliably produce unexpected connections, an answer to a question I hadn't asked yet, an idea arrived at sideways through the back door of a completely different inquiry. That kind of discovery is hard to engineer. It tends to happen in the gaps, in the wandering, in the space between the question you started with and the answer you eventually found. I still use these tools, frequently, and I think the benefits are real in ways that aren't trivial. The ability to externalize thinking, to pressure test an idea quickly, to get unstuck from a framing without spending 3 hours in the wrong direction. These things matter. But I've started to pay attention to a particular sensation that shows up sometimes after a fast answer arrives. A slight flatness, the sense that something was resolved without being understood, that the conclusion is now installed, but the understanding that would make it genuinely mine, the metabolized kind, built from actual engagement, didn't quite come with it. The answer arrived, the thinking didn't happen. What I keep turning over is whether this is a skill to protect, whether some questions, the ones that matter most, the ones about your own work, your own thinking, your own direction, are worth doing slowly, even when fast is available. Not out of romanticism about difficulty, not as a performance of intellectual virtue, but because some kinds of understanding only build the hard way. And the hard way requires staying inside the question long enough for it to actually do something to you. The tool can answer the question. Only you can be changed by it.
The problem didn't change. The question did. And somehow that was enough. Reframing gets talked about in self-help circles in a way that makes it sound cosmetic, a mental trick, a way of feeling better about something without actually changing it. Put a positive spin on it, find the silver lining, which is a very different thing from what actually happens when a genuine reframe occurs. A genuine reframe isn't a mood adjustment, it's a structural change in the question itself, which means a structural change in what answers are even available to you. The distinction matters because one is decoration and the other is architecture. There's a story I keep thinking about from the history of medicine. For decades, stomach ulcers were understood to be caused by stress, by the acidic environment created by anxiety and tension. Treatments were built around that understanding. Lifestyle changes, antacids, stress reduction. The whole edifice of ulcer treatment was constructed on that premise. And then, Barry Marshall, an Australian physician, couldn't shake the feeling that the question was wrong. Not the answers, the question. He wasn't asking how to better manage stress-related ulcers. He was asking whether ulcers were stress-related at all. And when he finally cultured bacteria from a patient's stomach lining, then famously drank the culture himself to prove infection was possible, the entire framework collapsed and rebuilt. Ulcers are largely bacterial. They respond to antibiotics. A decade of careful answers to the wrong question overturned by one person willing to question the question. That's an extreme example, but the structure of it shows up everywhere, at every scale.
The stuck creative project that unlocks when you stop asking how to improve what you have and start asking whether you're making the right thing at all? The relationship difficulty that shifts when you stop asking how to get the other person to change and start asking what you're actually trying to protect? The career decision that clarifies when you stop asking which option is safer and start asking which version of yourself you're trying to become. In each case, the reframe doesn't supply the answer. It supplies a better space for the answer to exist in. What's interesting is that genuine reframes are almost always available. There's almost always a different angle on a problem, but they're genuinely hard to produce on demand. The mind under pressure tends to narrow rather than widen. It looks for solutions inside the existing frame rather than questioning the frame itself. Because questioning the frame means accepting, at least temporarily, that you don't know what you're dealing with. And that's a particularly uncomfortable place to be when the pressure to resolve something is high. Which means the reframe tends to arrive either in moments of unusual quiet, a walk, a shower, the edge of sleep, or through conversation with someone who isn't inside your frame and doesn't feel the same pressure to stay there. Someone who can ask the question you weren't asking. There's something worth sitting with in that. The reframes that changed things, the ones that actually mattered, I can rarely trace them back to a sustained effort of will. They came from somewhere more sideways, from a question asked at an angle by someone or something that wasn't trying to solve the original problem but happened to illuminate it differently. Which suggests that part of developing this skill isn't about forcing better questions directly, it's about creating the conditions where different questions can arrive. More space, more angles, more willingness to hold the problem loosely rather than gripping it hard in one fixed orientation. The answer you need might already exist. It's just waiting for the question to turn slightly toward it. Most creative work gets described in terms of answers. The finished painting, the completed novel, the product that shipped, the idea that landed. The artifact is what's visible, the thing that can be shared and evaluated and responded to. So naturally, that's where the attention goes. But if you spend time with people who make things, who genuinely make things as a practice rather than an occasion, something becomes clear. The creative process tends to begin much earlier than the first mark. It begins with a question. Not always an articulate one. Sometimes it's barely a question at all, more of an itch, a dissatisfaction, a sense that something hasn't been said quite right yet, or hasn't been made, or hasn't been looked at from the particular angle you keep being pulled toward. But that pull has a shape, and the shape is a question. What's interesting is how rarely that question is direct. The creative questions that produce something genuinely new tend to be oblique, angled slightly away from the obvious. Not what is the best painting of this subject, but what would this subject look like if you loved it differently? Not how do I write this story well, but what is this story actually about if I stop protecting the comfortable version of it? The question that opens a new creative space almost never sounds like the question you were supposed to be asking. There's a reason for that. The obvious question points at the obvious answer, the thing that's already been made, already been said, the territory that's already been mapped. An oblique question slips past the existing maps entirely. It points at something that doesn't have a name yet because no one has looked at it from that exact angle before. I think this is why the most interesting creative work often feels like it came from a question its maker couldn't quite shake. Not a question they decided to explore. The ones you decide to explore tend to produce competent, respectable, slightly airless work. But a question that kept returning, that made the existing work feel insufficient, that wouldn't let the maker rest in what they already knew how to do. The question as irritant, as the thing that won't leave you alone until you've gone somewhere you didn't know how to go. What that requires, practically, is a willingness to begin without knowing where you're going, which runs directly against most of the formal training around creative work, which tends to emphasize planning, intention, clarity of purpose, all valuable things, but clarity of purpose applied too early can close down the very question that might have led somewhere genuinely new. There's a particular kind of creative work that can only be discovered rather than planned, that requires staying uncertain long enough, which loops back to what we were sitting with earlier, to let the question pull you somewhere the plan wouldn't have taken you. I noticed this in my own thinking. The ideas that have felt most alive, most like mine in some specific way, almost never came from deciding to explore something. They came from a question I couldn't dismiss, a curiosity that kept surfacing despite everything more practical demanding my attention. Following that, taking the oblique question seriously, even when it's inconvenient, even when you can't yet articulate what it's pointing at, that's a different relationship to creative work than making things you already know how to make. It's riskier, less efficient. The question might not lead anywhere you can use. But the questions that do land, the ones that pull you somewhere genuinely unmapped, tend to produce the kind of work that feels necessary rather than just accomplished. The difference between a thing that exists because someone made it and a thing that exists because it needed to exist. Most of us know that difference when we feel it. The question is whether we're willing to follow the question that gets us there.
Not every question is meant to be answered. That sounds like a way of avoiding something, a philosophical escape hatch, a comfort for people who don't want to do the hard work of figuring things out. But I don't mean it that way. Some questions are engines. They're meant to be resolved, closed, converted into action. The vast majority of the questions we encounter work this way, and the ability to move through them efficiently is genuinely useful. But there's another kind. Questions that don't want resolution so much as they want to be inhabited, carried, returned to over months or years, not because you're procrastinating on the answer, but because the question itself is doing something for you, orienting you, keeping something alive, preventing a certain kind of premature settling that would stop the thinking before it was finished. Rilke wrote about this. In Letters to a Young Poet, he advised his correspondent to live the questions, not to chase the answers prematurely, to trust that if you could stay inside the question long enough, honestly enough, you might one day find yourself living your way into an answer without quite noticing the transition. That image has stayed with me for a long time, living your way into an answer. Not thinking your way there, living there. There's something in that distinction that feels important. Thinking your way to an answer is something you can do in an afternoon. Living your way there requires actual experience, actual time, the kind of slow accumulation of evidence that only happens when you keep showing up to the same question across many different versions of yourself. The question worth living with tends to be the one that doesn't have an obvious answer, not because it's unanswerable in principle, but because the honest answer depends on things you don't yet know about yourself. Who you'll turn out to be under pressure, what you'll find you actually value when the values you claimed get tested, what direction reveals itself as yours when you followed enough wrong ones to know the difference. You can't think your way to those answers in advance. You can only stay close to the question and pay attention to what accumulates. I find there's a particular quality of attention that these long questions require, something more like listening than analyzing, less about applying force to the problem and more about keeping yourself available to what the problem gradually discloses. And what tends to happen, slowly, non-linearly, in ways that resist any clean narrative, is that the question changes shape as you do. The thing you were asking at 30 looks different at 40, not because the words changed, but because you did. The question deepens rather than closes. It gets more precise in some ways, more open in others. There's no arrival, just a continuous refinement of what you're actually asking. The questions that have done the most for my thinking have almost never been the ones I solved. They've been the ones I've carried long enough that they started to feel like a part of my inner life,
present without demanding resolution, orienting without controlling, available when I return to them, slightly different each time, because I'm slightly different each time. I think that's what it actually means to be someone who takes their own thinking seriously, not someone who has arrived at a set of clear conclusions, but someone who maintains a living relationship with the questions that matter most to them. Someone for whom thinking is ongoing rather than completed. So I want to leave you with something, not an answer and not even a question I've chosen for you, because the one worth carrying is always the one that already has its hooks in you. You probably already know which question that is, the one that keeps coming back, the one you've been circling without quite looking at directly, the one that makes something in you go quiet when it surfaces. What would change in your work, in your relationships, in the direction you're moving, if you stopped treating that question as something to get past and started treating it as something worth actually living with?